Good afternoon, everyone. Warmest of welcomes to this virtual seminar from Sulgrave, Continuities and Disruptions in Transatlantic Histories. I think everybody who's on the call this afternoon knows the format. We will, after my introductory remarks, have a virtual tour of the manor with our expert senior guide, Thea Young. There'll be an opportunity for questions to Thea. We then have our first workshop at 1:30 with Sam Edwards and Grace Mallon. That will be chaired by Nick Way, my colleague at Sulgrave and Vice Chairman of the Trust. We'll then have a brief break before moving into the second workshop at about 2:40, when we welcome our speakers Jay Sexton, colleague and friend from the Kinder Institute in Missouri, formerly at Oxford, and Tom Cusham at Birmingham, to speak about their subjects. And I'll then make some concluding remarks after questions and answers to the panelists. So we have three transatlantic themes today. Rather remarkably, this is the 100th anniversary in 2021 of Sulgrave Manor becoming an asset for the public. An asset for the public, not just in the UK, but in the world too, and especially in the United States, with which Sulgrave has, through the family of George Washington, such very close connections. Sulgrave was acquired to mark and celebrate 100 years of peace between Britain and the United States, and that transatlantic theme therefore resonates through Sulgrave's history as it resonates through our seminar today. And how remarkable it is that that transatlantic theme should be echoed in real time with the G7 meeting in Cornwall today and tomorrow, with President Biden's arrival and leaders of other G7 nation states there too, to discuss problems of which affect all of the major democracies in the world in a time of extraordinary turbulence in international relations and of great challenge to democracy and indeed to the rule of law being another transatlantic theme which underpins our considerations today as it underpins our joint histories. And the third transatlantic theme is that we have a transatlantic audience. I offer the warmest special welcome to our friends and colleagues from the United States. We are delighted to welcome Jay Sexton and his colleagues from the Kinder Institute, Kevin Butterfield, who is Executive Director of the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington. We welcome members of the NSCDA, the National Society of Colonial Dames of America, great supporters of Sulgrave, and the Friends of Sulgrave Manor, who are decisively important friends and colleagues of ours and supporters of all that Sulgrave does. And friends and colleagues from institutes around the United States and within the United Kingdom. I welcome you all. I'm delighted that you're here. I would encourage you to participate by posing questions, which will be handled by my colleague Shanna. And Shanna has done all of the remarkable technical work to make today possible. And to she and Thea Young, I owe a great debt of thanks, and I record my thanks to them now. And thank you to everybody on this call for taking the time and giving your energy, and for participating intellectually in the themes that are going to be discussed in Sulgrave as house and symbol, and its place in transatlantic relations, and to what it points and what it does not. Our first item of business then is to move to the virtual tour of the manor with Thea Young. And before I invite Thea to give us that tour, let me just say, if I may, that the manor will be, government regulations permitting, fully reopened from early July. And I very much hope that as many of you as possible will take the opportunity to visit Sulgrave. I remember to this day the thrill that I had in walking under through the entrance porch at Sulgrave and noticing, as I did, and I think Thea will point this out in her talk in a few moments' time, noticing the remarkable bars and stars, the bars and mullets of the coat of arms of the Washington family, and recognizing it because, of course, it provides the core design principles of the flag of Washington, D.C. in the United States, which I had first seen when just a child, and which made a considerable impression upon me. And to see that link, that vivid visual link between Sulgrave, 16th century Tudor house, and the flag of Washington, D.C., the capital of the most powerful nation state on the face of the earth, was a thrilling moment for me. And I think my heart skips every time I return to Sulgrave, which I now very frequently do, to see it. So please come and see what is a remarkable house and a remarkable symbol. And with that, I will turn to my colleague, Thea Young, who is going to give us a virtual tour of the manor. Thea, we're very grateful to you.
Welcome to Sulgrave Manor, ancestral home of George Washington, first President of the United States of America. Visitors to Sulgrave Manor in the 16th century would have learnt something about Lawrence Washington before even knocking on his front door. Above the porch we have three clues to his wealth and his status. First of all, we have the Washington coat of arms. And then above the window, we have Queen Elizabeth I, the royal coat of arms. And then atop that, a rather charming triangular motif, which shows two little sheep heads, and in between the two heads is stacked bales of wool. So this visual essay tells us something about Lawrence's ancestry. The coat of arms shows 3 stars, or more correctly mullets, and 2 bars. And this coat of arms came into being during the 14th century. The royal coat of arms, with the English lion and Welsh dragon, tells of Lawrence's political persuasion. And the wool motif, perhaps more importantly, tells us how Lawrence made his money, and he made it in the very profitable wool trade. Although Lawrence Washington had important family connections, the Parr family, and the Catherine Parr was the 6th and final wife of Henry VIII, and the Spencers at Ramlington, and then later at Althorpe, Lawrence had to make his way in the world, and he chose to get into the wool trade. Now, he was able to take advantage of the increased opportunities at that time for self-advancement. After all, Thomas Wolsey, Thomas Cromwell, both from lowly beginnings, had reached the most important and the highest posts in the land. So Lawrence settled in Northampton, and he happened to marry 2 wealthy young widows, which was always a good thing back in the 16th century. But he prospered swiftly in Northampton in the wool trade, and he was in fact mayor of Northampton on 2 occasions. And Lawrence was also able to benefit from the dissolution of the monasteries when land and property was sold off during the reign of Henry VIII. And Sulgrave Manor was in fact owned by a priory in Northampton, and it came on the market for sale, and Lawrence was able to purchase it and then build his substantial stone walled and roofed house. And the house then extended a goodly way on both sides of the port, west and east. So the house was traditionally called a Tudor longhouse. It stretched a long way, but it was in fact only one room and a stairwell deep. The screens passage traditionally divided the working part of the house from the living and domestic side. The Great Hall here is a little bit of a medieval hangover, but like Henry VIII's Great Hall at Hampton Court, it implies long-held social status. So Lawrence has this Great Hall here, and he would have perhaps used this space for entertaining his guests, for receiving his business colleagues, and generally creating an impression. We've got the beam ceiling here, we have stone floor, glazed windows and a large fireplace. All of these attributes saying wealth and status. Now, as I said, the house was much larger. It would have extended left and right here. This door here would have led on to more intimate and cosy rooms for the family. Although Lawrence might have held feasts and celebrations here. Mrs. Washington might have dispensed salt, sugar, spices from within this cupboard here. It's lockable. So salt, sugar, spices, all very expensive in those days. And LW is on the door here with one of the 5-pointed stars. Shields in the windows here, while not originals, they do give a clue to Lawrence's family connections. We have his parents' marriage, and it's through his parents that there is a link to the Spencers of Althorpe. His own marriage to his second wife, Amy Pargeter, and then his eldest son, Robert's marriage to Elizabeth Light of Radway Grange. You'll see that the shields are split, so we have the gentleman's coat of arms on the left and the lady's coat of arms on the right. Family connections were incredibly important back in the 16th century. It was very important to be connected with influential people. This lofty bedchamber again indicates wealth and status, the height of this chamber in a time when most people lived in lowly dwellings. And Mrs. Washington might have used this space during the day to bring her friends and relations, the ladies, to sit beside the fireplace or beside the window overlooking the garden. People were getting very interested in gardens in those days. They had the money to take advantage of all the new plants that were being brought back from voyages of discovery and trade journeys. And it was a way of showing their interest in the wider world and their trade connections. While these lovely bed curtains are modern, Mrs. Washington would have had textiles here. Textiles were incredibly expensive in those days. Probably on the walls here, there would have hung painted cloths, but she would have had curtains, I'm sure, on any four-post or tester bed here. The curtains were useful for keeping out drafts and for privacy as well. Now the slips on these curtains remind us of Elizabethan rural life and the wool trade, and also our American connections here. And from this room one could have accessed further chambers and bedrooms left and right. The two little rooms here would undoubtedly have been slept in by Washington children. There were 11 children born to Lawrence and his second wife Amy, 4 boys and 7 girls, and all the children survived infancy, childhood and grew up to be adults, which was pretty amazing in the 16th century. Yeah. This is the oldest door, 16th century, and imagine all the hands that have touched that door handle. The next generation of householders were responsible for taking down the wings and building this 18th century wing out at right angles to the original house. There are 2 bedrooms here along this corridor. This bedroom tells about the all-important wool trade, which did actually start to decline towards the end of the 16th century. And this little bedroom here shows some of the things that have been found at Sulgrave Manor during its restoration in the early part of the 20th century. And during the 18th century, the house declined into a very lowly and unloved farmhouse, and the area was renowned for highwaymen and poachers. There are attic rooms above here, but this narrow back stairs leads down to the kitchen. The contents of the kitchen came from a house in the south of England. The contents came complete, and it's not hard to imagine that the technology of kitchen equipment in the 18th century hadn't moved on that far from the 16th. So you can imagine 16th century cook working on a kitchen similar to this, and the heat and the smell and the smoke. We've got the hearth fire here, the crane arm with the pots hanging above, the bread oven, and the spit with the spit jack here, and also a pump, a water pump, a rather indulgent development, but later, of course, in time. This cosy and intimate room is the 18th century oak parlour, and it's a good compare and contrast moment with the oak solidness of the 16th century. And the mirror here to reflect the candlelight, the china for tea drinking, and the spinet all tell us about the development in craftsmanship, in trade and commerce of the 18th century. And George Washington ordered a spinet to be shipped from London to Mount Vernon for his stepdaughter to learn to play on. The furniture is more delicate, it's curvy, it's upholstered. Lawrence's oldest son, Robert, inherited the manor, but eventually sold it to a nephew and then out of family hands. About that time, 1656, John Washington, Lawrence's great-great-grandson, and whose father had been born here at Sulgrave Manor, travelled to the colony of Virginia, initially to trade and return to England, but he didn't. He settled in Virginia and he prospered there. And then his great-grandson, George, was born in the 18th century. So we have 200 years between Lawrence, here in the middle of rural England at Sulgrave Manor, and the first president in the 18th century in Virginia, with John making that all-important trip across the Atlantic. A visit to Sulgrave Manor is a glimpse into the past, but it's much more than that. The house has its own story. It was a comfortable family home in the 16th century. It was knocked about a bit, wings came down, an 18th century wing built. It then became a lowly farmhouse, unloved and generally forgotten. And then it was rescued in the early part of the 20th century by the Anglo-American Peace Committee. They purchased the house and restored it and opened it to the public in 1921 as a symbol of peace and friendship between the United States and Britain, to celebrate the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in 1814. And today, very much at the forefront of what we do here at the Manor, is those links of 500 years of culture, language, trade, and much more.
Thea, thank you so much. Terrific tour. And I think you convey splendidly just what a special place Sulgrave is. So thank you very much indeed. And we have now 7 or 8 minutes in which we can invite questions to you. So if those colleagues on the call who would like to ask questions would do so by communicating with Shanna, that would be terrific. And I will then select 1 or 2 of those questions and put them to Thea. Thea, I wonder if I might just start off whilst colleagues on the call are thinking about their questions and ask you, if I may, if you remember how you felt about Sulgrave on your first visit to the house. Do you remember your reaction?
Yes. I remember taking my children to Sulgrave Manor when they were quite young, and it was sort of quite a delight. In those days, the sort of major route between Northampton and Oxford hadn't been built, and one felt as though one was coming into an incredibly rural area and quite lonely. And then you came to this amazing, very beautiful stone-built house with charming garden, and had a terrific tour and saw all the lovely things. And I was enchanted by the little shoe that had been found during the restoration, that had been worn by a Washington child. And I immediately bought the book that had been written by Cynthia Harnett about the shoe at the Manor. And then, because I'd enjoyed that so much, of course, I taught for decades. I took school children to Sulgrave Manor as well, and I had them dressed up, and I'd taught them a dance and everything to do. So so for a long time I've known about Sulgrave Manor, loved it, and then by chance I started working at Sulgrave Manor. So it's been in my consciousness for actually a very long time, probably since at least the late 1970s and then mid 80s.
Well, Thea, we're delighted and grateful to you immensely to you for your long service to the manor and to any number of visitors whom you've shown round. So thank you very much. We have some questions coming in and we have only 5 minutes. One colleague, Laurie McArtos, asks whether George Washington ever visited Sulgrave, and I think we can answer that. He did not. Indeed, he didn't visit Britain.
No.
And Alice Kelly has asked whether the house has required extensive work or any significant periods of restoration to maintain it. And Thea and I know that, and indeed Nick Way, who's in on this call, know very well that it's required enormous work, and not least in the last 3 years. In the last 3 years, we have conducted significant external renovations at considerable cost, and more recently have renovated the entire interior of the manor, and it just looks in apple pie order. So it's been very sad that people haven't been able to see it over the last year, but another reason to come and see it now. And I would underline that those works would not have been possible without the very generous support that has been given us by the Friends of Sulgrave Manor in the United States and by the National Society of the Colonial Dames. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. I don't know her or his name at all, Thea, but it's a really interesting question. And she or he asks, how do people from the UK and the USA react? And do they react differently to their visit to Sulgrave Manor?
A lot of people find the house absolutely charming, and very often there's a comment, well, you could just move in, couldn't you? Yes, we've been to big places and walked around, but this, you could move in, you could live here. It's got a special atmosphere, which is lovely for welcoming visitors. And of course, visitors from the US love the fact that we fly both flags at the manor, and to come across the Atlantic to England actually to see their flag flying is pretty special for them. But the interest in the family, the house is huge, and most people are taken aback by a visit to the manor. Just how charming and how interesting, because there's so many stories.
Indeed.
As I said, the house is its own story, as well as the family and why it is what it is today.
Thank you. We have a question which asks about the meaning of the triangle, quote unquote, above the royal coat of arms, and that is the reference, isn't it, Thea, to the source of the wealth of the Washingtons, right, namely in sheep and the wool business.
That's
it was
right.
an affirmation of just how commercial these people were.
Absolutely, it was, and it's all about money and wealth in those days. It's incredibly important to show your wealth as well. I think we missed the first bit of the video. Visitors would have walked up there back in the 16th century and known something about Lawrence even before knocking on his front door, because they could see his ancestry, his royalist connections, and how he made his money, and that was incredibly important.
Thank you, Thea. Norman Hudson, a distinguished former chair of the Sulgrave Manor Trust, asks Thea a question which I'm sure you will know the answer to, which is how many visitors actually think Sulgrave was George Washington's home, and whether they're disappointed when they discovered that it wasn't, and how you deal with it?
Yes, we still get people who think, yeah, he was born, and they're sort of surprised. But I explain to them that George was a Virginian. He was born in Virginia, and that sort of set him apart a bit from sort of others at the time, like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and the fact that they'd all had this John Adams had this classical education. George should have come to England to finish his education, but didn't, started work at age 16. So they're interested in that storyline, certainly. Some people say, did George visit? And again, I say no. He had, while he was sort of interested in England, wish he'd come. He had a lot on his mind at the time.
Yes, indeed. Yes, he didn't want for job pressures. Thea, thank you very much indeed. I think we should draw a halt to our questions. And I know we could go on for much longer. There is, I think that Byron Schaefer has tried to ask a question. I think that question has not quite come through, Byron. But if you were to ask it at some point in the afternoon, either Nick or I will do our very best to ensure that your question is answered, if you'd like to put it in that way. So we now move to our first workshop, Sulgrave's House and Symbol. And in thanking Thea, I now thank Sam Edwards and Grace Mallon, whom Nick Way, my colleague, as Vice Chair of the Trust, will introduce. Sam and Grace, it's terrific to have you here. I know that Sulgrave is somewhere that Sam in particular knows very well because he's done research here, but it's splendid to have you share your expertise with us this afternoon. So Nick, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Nigel, and welcome everyone to this webinar on Sulgrave as House and Symbol. My name is Nick Way and I'm a trustee of Sulgrave Manor. For 10 years, I led a membership organisation for the owners of historic houses, including Sulgrave, so my own career has been steeped in history, as it were. We have an audience this afternoon. The participants list says 63, but I know that some of you are multiples, so we reckon there are more than 70 of you out there, including year 12, year 13 students, undergraduates, experts and researchers. So welcome all, and two excellent guest speakers. In a minute, I will invite our speakers to make their opening statements or contributions of about 10 to 15 minutes each, after which we will open up the webinar for questions and a discussion. As this is a webinar, may I ask you all to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, as Nigel has said, to put your questions, and I will do my best to make sure that the speakers answer them. And we've got about an hour in total, so that there will be plenty of time for questions and a discussion. But first, a brief introduction to the subject and to our speakers. In this era of re-examining buildings and statues and former inhabitants, we might first ask, what does a house tell us? Well, you've heard quite a lot from Thea, pretty good start. What does it tell us about the people who lived there and about the world in which they lived and worked? Did they bring up families? Did they have money to spend on improving the house? And if so, how did they get it? Did they use the house for themselves, just for themselves, or for entertaining, for showing off, or as academics might put it, networking and political advancement? So we want to use this webinar to see what Sulgrave Manor can tell us about Tudor England. A house is more than its walls, its windows and its roof. It is also its furnishings, its furniture, its art, if we're lucky, but also the mementos and the records left by its inhabitants. Everything that reveals what went on there. We also want to see if Sulgrave can give us some clues about the world of pre-independence America. That sounds like a long shot, but Sulgrave Manor was built and lived in by no ordinary family, as you've heard, the Washingtons, who had strong personalities, and their direct descendants were no ordinary people either, particularly the most famous of them all, George Washington. Can Sulgrave give us clues as to his personality and the world in which he operated in mid and late 18th century America? I'm delighted to tell you that our speakers today are very well qualified to address these and other questions. You have their biographies in your programme, so I won't read them out in full. First up will be Sam Edwards, reader in Transatlantic History at Manchester Metropolitan University. As you can see from his bio, Sam has strong credentials on the study of the UK-US relationship through our linked history. Grace Mallon graduated in history at Oxford University and is now studying for a doctorate. Her research is in the relationship between the individual American states and the new federal government in the early years of the US. Both are well placed to explore the line of history from George Washington back to Sulgrave and what Sulgrave, the house, its family, and their lives can reveal about the values and ambitions of early Americans. So first of all, Sam, over to you. Thank you very much for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that introduction, and my thanks as well to Nigel and to Shannon, and obviously all the wonderful people at Sulgrave Manor for this invitation to contribute to this afternoon's proceedings. I'm just going to share with you all some slides, so hopefully this all works out. Bear with me just one moment. So hopefully you can all see this first slide. What I'd like to do in the course of my brief talk is home in on a very particular moment in what Thea in her presentation a moment ago elegantly referred to as the long history of Sulgrave Manor. I want to turn attention to a moment in the summer of 1921 where the manor is turned into what contemporaries would call an Anglo-American shrine. I want to give some thought as to why is it that that moment in the summer of 1921 draws this attention. Why Sulgrave Manor, and why the life and line and lineage of George Washington? Why does it get this interest and attention? And in doing so, at its broadest, I want to try and say something about Sulgrave Manor and its place in early 20th century Anglo-American relations, and especially in the years in and around the First World War. So hopefully I can give you some sense over the next 15 minutes of perhaps why it is we're having this conversation this afternoon, and why it is we're talking about Sulgrave Manor and Anglo-American relations. Let me start by taking you back to the summer of 1921. The idea for establishing Sulgrave Manor, as contemporaries called it, a shrine to the Anglo-American relationship, has origins in the years immediately prior to the outbreak of the First World War. And both Nigel and Thea have already hinted at some of these origins that lie in an event, a widely anticipated event in 1914, which was to be the centenary of the Treaty of Ghent. I'll say a little bit more about that in due course, but it's around at this moment in time, 1911 into 1912, that the idea of acquiring Sulgrave Manor and as establishing it as an Anglo-American memorial is first raised. And those involved in this idea are some of the influential and significant Anglo-American elites of the era. We're talking people like Andrew Carnegie and Theodore Roosevelt, and on this side of the Atlantic, Earl Grey, Sir Edward Grey, amongst others. In January of 1914, the manor is then purchased. It's acquired by the Anglo-American Society, and the idea is that it will be unveiled and opened over the course of that year as this memorial. But of course, as you might anticipate, looking at that date, global events intervene, and the outbreak of war in Europe in the summer of 1914 means that plans for the manor, and indeed the broader plans for the centenary of the Treaty of Ghent, are all put on hold. It's not then until the summer of 1921, in the aftermath of the First World War, that the plans are revisited, and now the manor is indeed to be opened, unveiled, and dedicated as this Anglo-American memorial, as a memorial to the memory of George Washington, and also as a statement of the continued closeness of the Anglo-American connection into the 20th century. And the images that you see on this slide here, courtesy of the manor, are of that day, June in 1921. At the top there, you've got a large crowd gathered. A crowd processed through the village of Sulgrave. They gathered at the manor, and there they bore witness to oratory and to speeches and to ceremony. And you get a sense of that in that top image there underneath the walnut tree. The image at the bottom is a close-up of that same occasion, that same day. Here you've got the kind of staged area with the gathered dignitaries. One of them is the American ambassador. And you can see there a bust of George Washington being unveiled. June of 1921. Now, as a historian of transatlantic relations and one who's especially interested in how culture and commemoration have been used, especially in the 20th century, to cultivate the idea of a close Anglo-American connection, this fascinates. It fascinates me. It fascinated me when I first turned my attention to this a few years ago. It continues to fascinate. And it's especially fascinating for a couple of other reasons, I would suggest. One is that this isn't isolated. This is part of something broader. And an example of that is, for instance, this. Note the date. 9 days after Sulgrave Manor is established as a shrine to the Anglo-American relationship, a statue of the first president is unveiled in London, just outside the National Gallery, Trafalgar Square. Again, it's an occasion of ceremony. Again, dignitaries and diplomats are involved. And again, it's a project with origins the other side of the First World War. If you're interested, the statue is still there. It is a gift of the Commonwealth of Virginia to the British government, and it's a copy of the well-received statue of George Washington in the Virginia State Legislature by the famous French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdin. And it's a well-received statue, very popular. This is the statue gifted to the British government by the Commonwealth of Virginia, and they're dedicated in the summer again of 1921. I think this makes this interesting. Yeah, here we have sustained and significant interest in Britain in celebrating and commemorating the ancestry of George Washington. When you factor in once again, though, who George Washington is, and it's still more interesting. George Washington, we will all, I no doubt recall, is the man who leads the American colonies in rebellion against British imperial rule, the first president of a newly independent United States, the man who, in some respects, ends the first British Empire. Yet this is the figure in 1921 receiving all of this ceremony and commemoration in Britain, indeed at the very heart of the British imperial state, Trafalgar Square in London. This, as a historian, draws out of me that question that so occupies historians. We're kind of like toddlers, and the question is, why? Why this moment? Why this man? Why this real estate? Why does this happen? And what I want to do over the next 10 minutes is try to explain it. I want to put these activities in three kind of connected contexts. Something about the man himself, the historical reality, the connection, the line linking back to Sulgrave. Something also, though, about the broader cultural and political context. And then finally, something about the specifics of the years in and around the First World War, when, of course, these activities come to fruition. First up, the raw historical detail, that ancestral connection. Now, it is not my intention here to wade into the fraught territory of the fine details of the Washington ancestry. Various reasons for that. One, I would be a good 2 or 3 centuries out of my depth. Second, I'm no doubt talking to people far more expert than me. And also that I'm conscious that my colleague Grace is going to say a little bit more about Washington, the historical figure, his understanding of the Sulgrave connection in her talk. So I'll confine myself to the bit that I find interesting in the context of these 1921 events, which is what happened sort of 3 or 4 decades prior to that. It's in the 1880s and 1890s that something which has been discussed, even right back to when George was alive, something that's been discussed for quite some time, the fine details of his ancestral line, is finally now kind of pinned down. Key details are now confirmed there in the 1880s, 1890s, and especially one key bit. How do you get from Virginia back to Blighty, back to England? What's the line linking that? So in the 1880s, 2 or 3 significant publications, one for you there, Henry Waters, The English Ancestry of George Washington. Finally, these kind of English details, that English connection is pinned down. And it means there's intense interest at the end of the 19th, turn of the 20th century in this question of George Washington's English ancestry. You can see it even in the pages of the London Times. The letters pages are full of engaged correspondence, frequently at the end of the 19th, early 20th century on this very subject. And I'm highlighted 3 years for you there, 1894, 1901, 1904, but it runs up to the eve of the First World War itself. Lots of correspondence all about George Washington, his English ancestry, what are the fine details, where are the connections? So around this moment in time, turn of the 20th century then, that various communities in Britain, especially in England, now start to assert and make their claims. One of those is, of course, Sulgrave, which draws our attention, obviously and rightly, today. It's why we're here, it's what we're talking about. Others as well, though, Washington up in County Durham, Washington Old Hall now in the care of the National Trust. Just 6 or 7 miles north of where I'm talking to you from now, Wharton in North Lancashire likewise claims an ancestral connection to the Washington family. Purley in Essex. This is an exhaustive list. Some of you listening might be aware of many others. It's not exhaustive, but it's suggestive of some of those localities claiming this connection, asserting it at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. The images here, Thea has already explained about the Washington family coat of arms in her talk. Just beneath that, and that image, the photograph, the black and white photograph, not great quality, my apologies for that. But this is a carving of the Washington coat of arms, the Washington family coat of arms, which was discovered in the masonry of the church tower of St Oswald's in Wharton in Lancashire in 1885. So it's kind of discovered just when all this interest in the ancestry is in the letters pages of the London Times. The two kind of go together. The genealogical scenes have been mined and the English connections confirmed. And look, here's some carving into the very stonework of a Lancashire parish church, affirming that sense of connection. Clearly, at root then of all this 1921 interest in the Washington connection is this raw historical fact that there is an ancestral link linking George Washington to Sulgrave Manor, amongst other places. But I want to suggest to you it's not just about the ancestry, it's also about the world in which this ancestry was discovered and confirmed and understood. And that world was a very particular moment in terms of Anglo-American relations. The Anglo-American relationship at the end of the 19th, early 20th century has been much discussed and debated and examined by scholars over the last half century or so. But there's one recurring idea that I want to draw to your attention here. And that is the idea that as we get into the 1880s, and we're now a century distant from the disruption of the American Revolution, as we get into the 1880s, 1890s, this is an era, say various historians, of rapprochement. That is a coming together of the United States and Great Britain, a coming together, a developing close relationship, the age of Anglo-American rapprochement. There are various reasons for that we don't have the time to get into here and now. I just want to flag up a couple of factors here which help us to understand why London and Washington are finding increasing common ground at the end of the 19th century. One is the broad geopolitical picture. Think of this moment, end of the 19th century, various growing tensions and rivalries developing in the world. From that British perspective, a great threat of the moment is the rise of Imperial Germany, its growing naval power just there across the North Sea. The United States is likewise a growing power across the Atlantic Ocean. And from that British perspective, then there's a quandary here. What to do to respond to this changing world? And one response then is to cultivate connection with the United States, an incredibly important economic trade relationship, partly because you've got this historical link, but also because there are various concerns about a rising Germany. So we've got end of the 19th century, transatlantic relations and Anglo-American connection being cultivated, an era of rapprochement. Feed into that picture a contemporary worldview, popular especially amongst Anglo-American cultural and political elites. This is an era in which leading figures in the American and British governments like to assert themselves, define themselves, claim themselves as being constituents, members of a single, in their terms, inverted commas, Anglo-Saxon community. And that idea is kind of suggested here by the image. The image is circa 1898, in and around the Spanish-American War, when America becomes an imperial power, a global power, and it's kind of powerfully evocative of this idea of rapprochement, of togetherness, of a single community. You've got here Britannia and Columbia holding their flags, Union flag and the Stars and Stripes. Above them, you've got the American Eagle and the British Lion. And in the foreground, you've got Uncle Sam and John Ball, hands clasped in friendship, hands clasped in the interest, quote, of humanity, civilization, and freedom. The confirmation of the English ancestry of George Washington is thus discovered, encountered in a very particular historical, cultural, political context, which is receptive to it, and also which is ready to kind of use that idea in a certain way. The final part of the picture is to take your attention now to the years specifically in and around the First World War. As we head towards the outbreak of war in 1914, Anglo-American relations at this point seem to be reasonably close and cordial, and certainly there's keen interest in celebrating that planned centenary of the Treaty of Ghent that Nigel mentioned in his comments and Thea's talked about, and I mentioned briefly a moment ago. And it is a big deal. The centenary of the Treaty of Ghent is going to be huge. If you look at the records for this, there are going to be ceremonies and pageants and performances and an exchange of commemorative statuary and all sorts of things. It's all going to culminate in Belgium itself in December of 1914. Now, you can guess where this is going. War intervenes. And none of this will come to be, at least not in 1914. When war breaks out, of course, there's now going to be some tensions in the Anglo-American relationship. Britain goes to war, the United States does not. Even when the United States joins in 1917, there are tensions still simmering beneath the surface over who's going to get the American troops across the Atlantic. The British Merchant Marine? Who's going to command them on the Western Front? British generals want them in their units. Once the war is done in 1918, again, tensions linger into the post-war period. And now Washington and London are arguing about the Treaty of Versailles and League of Nations. And the biggie, naval disarmament. The Imperial German Navy is done now. The Royal Navy wants to reassert itself as the dominant naval power. The US Navy wants parity. There are going to be fraught discussions about that issue right through to the middle of the 1920s. And this is the moment in which Sulgrave Manor becomes an Anglo-American shrine, and in which George is placed on his pedestal just outside the National Gallery in Trafalgar in London. I would suggest to you that if we put these three things together, we get a reasonably good sense as to why it happens, when it does, and where it does. At the heart of it is a detail of history, an ancestral connection, but it's also about the moment in time in which that ancestral connection is encountered. 3 decades of rapprochement and all this celebration of Americans and Britons as part of a single Anglo-Saxon community. Throw into the mix the ups and downs of Anglo-American relations in and around the First World War, and maybe Sulgrave Manor there in the summer of 1921 becomes an invaluable opportunity as tensions simmer to assert that beneath those tensions there are underlying unities. And how better to do that than to declare that the man who ended the First British Empire is at root in ancestry, and in the words of Lord Curzon at the statue dedication, a quote, great Englishman. Thank you very much, everybody. That's me done. I'm going to stop these slides now, and you'll get your screen back.
Thank you, Sam. That was brilliant timing, and lots of food for thought there. Brilliant how you placed Sulgrave in that global context and showed its value as a symbol as a result. So now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Grace Mallon, and you can tell us what you want to talk about, Grace, with a view perhaps a little more from the other side of the pond, if I'm right. Over to you, Grace.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Nick. Thanks, Nigel, and thanks, Sulgrave and the Rothermere for inviting me to give a talk. Thanks, Sam, for his fantastic talk, where there are going to be some interesting links to what I want to talk about as well. I am just going to share some slides as well. Yes, so I hope that will work. Yes, I'm going to take my time to tell you the story of how George Washington, first president of the United States, came to learn about Sulgrave and how he thought about his English ancestry as the leader of a nation that had just separated itself from the British Empire through a bloody and traumatic civil war, as Sam was telling us. What we're going to learn is that Washington's relationship with his English heritage, like that of many Americans in the post-revolutionary era, was quite complicated. He had a confusing mixture of feelings about his identity as an American of English descent. He also had mixed feelings about the politics of genealogy, having grown up in a society where family background was everything, but now standing at the head of a republic where all men were supposedly created equal. Early in December 1791, the English antiquarian and heraldry expert Sir Isaac Hudd sat down at his desk at the College of Arms on Queen Victoria Street in London, picked up his pen, and addressed a letter to President George Washington in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which was then the capital city of the United States. You can see Sir Isaac wearing his slightly horrendous wig over there, and that's the College of Arms, which is still in the same place. I wrote to Washington that from a sincere respect for the distinguished character of Your Excellency, I made genealogical collections many years ago relative to the family of Washington. Using a considerable range of manuscript sources, including wills and parish registers, Hurd had made a good start on establishing Washington's family history or genealogy, but some pieces were missing. The object of his letter was to ask Washington if Your Excellency will have the goodness to complete the imperfect sketch of your own pedigree here enclosed on the basis of documents that Washington and his American family might hold. Isaac Hudd had a considerable personal interest in America, as he explained to the president. His wife, Catherine Tyler Hurd, had been born in Boston, in the province of Massachusetts Bay, and was the niece of Sir William Pepperell, an English officer with a distinguished record of service in North America before the American Revolution. Though he had fond memories of colonial days, however, Hurd showed in his letters a sensitivity to Washington's republicanism, his rejection of monarchy and aristocracy, and his embrace, nominally at least, of the equality of white men with one another despite their backgrounds. In a 1793 letter, he wrote that Washington's family hath produced a character too distinguished to derive any luster from the avito honore. In other words, that Washington was a great man in his own right, not just because of his ancestry. Nevertheless, in the first letter Hurd sent to Washington in Philadelphia, he enclosed a painting of the Washington family's coat of arms, which we've seen a number of times over the course of the presentation so far. And it's interesting that Washington himself recognized this. He said, yes, we've also used this coat of arms in America. On the back of the painting was written, confirmed to Lawrence Washington of Sulgrave in the county of Northampton, Esquire, and his descendants, with the date 1595. In 1793, Hurd told the president, I am of opinion, though I cannot at present prove the fact, that your excellency is descended from Lawrence Washington of Sulgrave in Northamptonshire, Esquire, who died in 1616. How did Washington feel when he received these letters from London? There's some evidence that he was flattered by the unsolicited interest of an English Knight of the Garter like Hurd, a man who consorted with the great and the good of the British nobility. Washington referred repeatedly to the politeness of Hurd's letter, which meant something stronger in the late 18th century than what it means today. The English lexicographer Samuel Johnson wrote that to be polite was to be elegant of manners, a quality that Washington greatly admired. But when he replied to Hurd in May 1792, the president was also a bit defensive about the idea of investigating his family background. Washington wrote, "This is a subject to which I confess I have paid very little attention. My time has been so much occupied in the busy and active scenes of life from an early period of it, that but a small portion of it could have been devoted to researches of this nature, even if my inclination or particular circumstances should have prompted the inquiry." There's a lot going on here. Washington is reminding Hurd that he's a great soldier, a man of action, not some kind of leisurely scholar. Then he goes on to remind Hurd of the differences between the United States and the monarchies of the Old World. Very few cases, he wrote, occur where a recurrence to pedigree for any considerable distance back has been found necessary to establish such points as may frequently arise in older countries. He's saying a bit obliquely that family background just doesn't matter in America in the same way that it does in the monarchies of Europe. But despite all of these protestations that he wasn't really that interested in genealogy, and despite telling everyone who would listen that he was only going to reply to Hurd because the Englishman had written to him with such earnestness and politeness, Washington wasn't quite telling the truth when he indicated he had never been interested in his lineage. The American historian Karen Wolfe has shown that Washington certainly had recurred to his pedigree, as he put it earlier in life, and had drawn up his first family tree as a 20 or 21-year-old in 1753. This manuscript family tree is now held by the Library of Congress, and you can see that it begins with John and Lawrence Washington, the first generation of his family to settle in North America. Wolfe writes in the Smithsonian Magazine that men of Washington's status kept records as keepsakes, but also as indicators for legal matters like inheritance, in which property was transferred. One of the striking details of this family tree is that on the side of the paper where Washington has written Genealogy of the Washington Family in Virginia, he's also written a list running horizontally in this page orientation with the title A List of Tithables, and under that title there's a list of names. One of the names belonged to a white employee of the family, an overseer, but the others belonged to Black people enslaved by the Washington family. So this document really shows how family history or genealogy was tied together with status and with property ownership in colonial North America. Wolfe notes that Washington's 1753 family tree is surprisingly detailed, and that it suggests he had probably done some research into his lineage. In the 1790s too, Washington actually put quite a bit of effort into responding to Isaac Hurd's entreaty. Being in the presidential residence in Philadelphia rather than at his family plantation, Mount Vernon, in Northern Virginia, and not having a lot of family records to hand, Washington wrote to a relative, Hannah Fairfax Washington, for help. Mrs. Washington, as she wrote, searched over every old paper in my possession, but could find nothing that could give any information relative to the subject required. Fortunately, however, a family friend was able to supply an old book written by your brother Lawrence, from which he took several memorandums, and enclosed them to me, which I have copied and sent to you. These memorandums, composed by Washington's late brother, allowed the president to compose what he called a lineage, which he sent back to Hurd in London. Like the 1753 genealogy, this new lineage began in 1657 with the emigration of two brothers, John and Lawrence Washington, from the north of England to Bridges Creek on the Potomac in Virginia. But the 1792 version of the family tree was much more detailed than the sparse family history. It's several pages long. Moving on through the generations, the president described how his own father, Augustine Washington, had married twice, first to Jane Butler, who died in 1728, and then 2 years after Jane's death to Mary Ball, Washington's own mother, by whom, as Washington wrote, he had issue, George, born February 11th, Old Style, 1732. And if you look at the places I've underlined on the slide, you'll see he put after his own name, George, an asterisk, and at the bottom, asterisk, now President of the United States, which is quite a sort of interesting moment. Look, it's me. And it could well be that he was making sure that if this genealogy ever went to print or if it was published elsewhere, it was clear, his place in it. So where can this exchange between Washington and Hurd lead us? What can it tell us about how Americans understood themselves in relation to Britain and their past lives as British colonists in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution? The American historian Carrie Ann Yokota has argued that Americans underwent a process she calls unbecoming British in the decades after independence. This was a very tricky process. On the one hand, American patriots or revolutionaries had begun to construct a political and cultural identity in opposition to Britishness during the revolutionary struggle. They had rejected monarchy and called for a government of laws, not men. They had banned hereditary titles and declared that all men were created equal. They had adopted new visual symbols of Americanness, like the Liberty Cap and the Liberty Pole, the blue coat of the Continental soldier as against the red coat of the British regular, even the faux Indian costumes worn by the Sons of Liberty as they pitched bricks of East India tea into Boston Harbor during the Tea Party of 1773. And you can see here a later engraving of a raising of a Liberty Pole. And Baron Steuben was a great sort of American, German-American leader of the revolution. But at the same time, the revolutionaries had also relied on the language of Britishness to make their case to the king and parliament during the imperial crisis that had led to the breach in the empire. The basis of their complaint was that the government was not treating them equally with its subjects at home in Great Britain. To be taxed without their consent, to be taxed without representation, to have soldiers quartered in their homes, to be subject to coercive laws. These things were violations of their rights, not just as colonists, but as Englishmen who lived in North America. George Washington himself had been accustomed to appeal to his own Englishness, as he did when at the age of 22, he was trying to extract funds for a military campaign from the colonial governors of Maryland and Pennsylvania. He called upon them to display the heroic spirit of every freeborn Englishman to assert the rights and privileges of our king. It was a big leap for former British colonists to shed such a strongly held identity and put on a new one as free American citizens. And you can see here Thomas Jefferson's summary view of the rights of British America. More than that, what Yokota suggests is that Americans suffered a kind of cultural cringe, as our Australian friends would call it, after independence. At the same time as they asserted their superiority as an independent people, they felt a lingering sense of insecurity about the value of American culture by comparison with the grandeur of the old world. Elite Americans tried to make a virtue of Republican simplicity, with Washington famously wearing an American-made suit of brown broadcloth to his first inauguration, rather than a fancier outfit such as might be found in the royal courts of Europe. At the same time, however, and despite import taxes, Americans continued to import European luxury goods as signifiers of elite status, and European manufactured goods simply because they did not at that time have the capacity to produce everything they needed domestically. So even after the break with the British Empire, Americans actually, I think, import more from Britain than they had during the colonial period. They continued to rely on English law books like Blackstone's Commentaries to teach and study the law. They read English novels, poetry, and plays, and were mocked into the 19th century for the lack of a robust national literary tradition, however true that may have been at the time. They emulated English polite culture as closely as possible in social rituals like tea parties and formal evening engagements. There was even a kind of cultural brain drain, I'm going to assert a little bit tenuously, with two of the most gifted American-born artists of the Revolutionary era, Benjamin West and John Singleton Copley, both living much of their professional lives in London. And you can see this in this spectacular painting by Copley in the National Gallery, right by the statue of George Washington. Karen Wolfe, whom I mentioned before, is currently writing a book about genealogy in the early American, or I think in early America. So when that comes out, I'm sure she'll have a lot of interesting things to say about Washington and his relationship to Sulgrave and Englishness. For now, I think the idea of unbecoming British really helps to frame the president's interaction with Isaac Hudd. Hudd really was very polite and respectful towards Washington, and indeed towards the Republican standards of American political culture, making it clear that Washington's value rested on his own accomplishments rather than his heritage. Nevertheless, Washington was clearly a little uncomfortable with the idea of expressing interest in his family history, perhaps for fear of appearing to seek out aristocratic connections. He was careful to remind Hudd of the differences between British and American attitudes toward genealogy. At the same time, his denial of any real interest in the finer points of his family background feels to me like dissimulation. The effort the president put into complying with Hudd's request shows that his tangled feelings towards England as an American revolutionary had not entirely extinguished a sense of pride and affection towards his ancestral land. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. That was fascinating, and lots of food for thought there too. Now, I'm going to open up the discussion and ask people who want to ask questions to do it as we did before through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. But while people are thinking of questions, I've got a couple. One, they're on the same theme, and one's for Sam and one's for Grace. And I'm just going to, the commonality is that certainly when I was growing up, and I suspect when you two were growing up, and as people are still growing up now, we tend to think of the relationship between the UK and the US as being positive. And just today, the British Prime Minister and the US President are meeting, and with the hope from the British Prime Minister to sort of reaffirm this on the anniversary of the Atlantic Charter 80 years ago, to reaffirm the special relationship. So my question to Sam, Sam, you explained so clearly why the period before the First World War was so conducive to this expression of good relations. But I wanted to ask you whether it had been so, whether this atmosphere of rapprochement had been so all the time since the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, and whether and why things had changed if they had. And for Grace, looking at that same sort of period, I know it's not the period of Washington, but that early 20th century period, it occurs to me as an ignorant layman that there were lots of other nationalities arriving in the United States, had arrived. So there were, I don't know if there were as many Germans as there were people of English descent, and there were Italians and so on. And whether that interest that Sam talked about in Washington's lineage was used, came to the rescue, whether America was having some sort of, you call it a cultural cringe 100 years later, but whether they were looking for a new sense of identity, and whether George Washington was really useful from that point of view, or not. You know, you describe as being a bit schizophrenic about his lineage, but what the average Americans would have thought about the link with Britain, why they chose us and not anybody else. So Sam first. Sorry, I hope you can still remember my question after all that.
I think I can, Nick. Yes, thank you for that question. So in terms of, was it a smooth road to rapprochement from Ghent in 1814 through to rapprochement at the turn of the 20th century? The short answer is no, it's not a smooth road, and there are various moments of tension and difficulty in the Anglo-American relationship. Of course, one is what the Treaty of Ghent concludes, which is, of course, the War of 1812. the final moment in which the United States and Great Britain have been formally at war with one another. In the aftermath of that, there are still various tensions that simmer occasionally. In the 1860s, during the American Civil War, at one moment it looks like Britain might intervene in the conflict, and not on the side of Lincoln's Union, but perhaps indeed on the side of the Confederacy. And then as you get into the 1870s, 1880s, still lingering tensions. So I think you get the rapprochement at the end of the century, I think, for a variety of factors. A couple of them I touched on. I think it's about the geopolitical situation. I think it's about a racialized worldview. It's also that some of the things which have been causing tension now get resolved. So famous and now largely forgotten things like the boundary of Venezuela, which draws in both powers are arguing over what this boundary is going to be. This gets kind of settled and agreed. So you get to the end of the 19th century, things which have been causing tension between Washington and Westminster now start to get resolved, feed in the geopolitical picture, add in a racialized worldview, and you get, I think, the grounds for that sense of rapprochement.
Thanks, Sam. That was really helpful. Grace, make what you can out of my question.
I'll have a go. I'm really not an expert at all in the sort of Gilded Age progressive era in the same way that Sam will be. So if he has any thoughts, he's welcome to contribute them. I think one of the striking things that's happened recently, so with the Hamilton musical, don't forgive me for going off on a slight tangent, Hamilton is described as being an immigrant in the musical. But was he an immigrant? He was of British descent and he grew up in a British colony, and then he moved to another British colony to study, and then he participated in the American Revolution. To call him an immigrant, I think, is a little bit tenuous. And obviously, although George Washington's roots were not in North America, he was not native in that sense. He was, he was sort of established from the earliest decades, at least, of settlement. So if we're talking about this early 20th century with this racialized worldview towards not only people of color like African Americans and Native Americans, but also towards people from my own background, Irish and Italians, Poles, even people from Eastern Europe, from Scandinavia, are described as being not quite white or not quite Anglo. I think I'm not sure that George Washington's particular background in England is necessarily given to sort of generating national unity. But on the other hand, Washington's symbol from the earliest days, Washington as a symbol from the earliest days of the Republic in his own right, absolutely is, I think, a unifying force, and he is the symbol of the nation in this really important way. So I think in that sense, yes, adherence to Washington and the sort of cult of George Washington is important for national unity. But I don't know if Sam has any other thoughts on that.
Sam?
Just to add, I think Grace is absolutely on the mark there. I think one of the reasons why I think this British interest in celebrating the George Washington ancestral connection is welcomed by certain quarters in the United States is because of the domestic situation in the United States at this point in time. I didn't talk about this, but that's the other part of the picture here. In years in and around the First World War, various evidence which makes more than clear that this is an era in which there is a self-defining Anglo elite worried about its power and privilege. In the post-war period, we're going to get the problem of nativism and immigration restriction, and in that context, amongst that Anglo elite, celebrating the English ancestry of George Washington is also a means to affirm their sense of what Americanness is in the present, I think. So, yeah.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Ollie Ackroyd, who would like to take us back 2 years earlier than the Treaty of Ghent. You mentioned the war, Sam, and that war. And Ollie Ackroyd asks, would it be possible to discuss the impact of the War of 1812 on how, quote, Britishness, unquote, was viewed in the United States at the time, and whether this war had any influence on shaping those views? And also, how did the prominent public figures react to this? Who'd like to go first on that? Sam,
can I heroically say that I'm hoping Grace can, because I'm a good sort of century out of my depth there, so I don't know if Grace wants to take that one.
Let's give Grace, who'd like to go first.
Oh, absolutely. I'll have a go. So yeah, I mean that's a great question. I mean, and we actually have to start before the War of 1812, because I think the War of 1812 in itself comes out of a cultural, well, I mean, it comes out of a geopolitical situation, commercial problems, particularly sort of at a very fundamental level. But a lot of the way that it's articulated is to do with Britishness and, you know, and attitudes towards Britain. And I'm sure that Tom Cutteram will go into this more in his own talk. But essentially that, you know, American politics in the early Republic is defined by largely by sort of allegiance to Britishness or allegiance to a sort of liberty-loving revolutionary cause which is associated with France. So people like Thomas Jefferson would say, I'm more interested in the French side. People like John Adams would say, I think, or Alexander Hamilton would say, I'm more into, or even indeed George Washington would say, I'm more interested in the sort of in emulating Britain, in maintaining a close relationship with Britain. So I think the War of 1812 and its sort of outcome is interesting because essentially Americans claim victory, Britons kind of claim victory as well, or say, you know, that didn't go as badly as it could have done. But Americans really use it as a moment to define themselves as against like British North America. Canadians use it as a way to define themselves as against the United States. So I think British identity is really important, or opposition to British identity is and a rejection of Britishness and a kind of like last gasp of the Revolutionary War, where finally independent of Great Britain. I think that's absolutely sort of the outcome of the War of 1812 is that sort of identity shift.
Thanks, Grace. It's great. Sam, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just well, Grace was talking there, prompted in my mind something which I didn't talk about in the presentation a moment ago. But Grace was talking there about Canada in this dynamic as well, and that question after 1814 of Britishness and British North America versus the United States, and where Great Britain fits into all of this is prompted in my mind. One issue which comes out with all these commemorations of Washington in 1921, especially the statue at Trafalgar Square, is what will the Canadians think. And indeed, the initial placing of the Washington statue is not to be Trafalgar Square; it's to be outside the Palace of Westminster. That's where Abraham Lincoln is. We'll put George there at Westminster. But they changed their mind on this one, with the argument being that the Canadians won't like that. If we place a statue to the the man who rebels against British rule outside the Palace of Westminster, this is going to be a problem for Canadian-British relations. And so in the end, it goes to Trafalgar Square instead. But yes, something fascinating there about that is the other dynamic at work here, much less well known, much less appreciated, but Canada's place in that transatlantic connection as well.
Thank you. I always wondered why I was outside the National Gallery, and you've now told me why. That's fascinating. Now we've got about 10 minutes, maybe a bit more minutes left. And a word to all our attendees, just to say, because we have two such expert speakers, please don't be afraid to ask your questions, because you may think your question is not eminent enough, but I can assure you it's the straightforward questions that usually get under the radar. So while you're thinking of those questions, I'm going to be cheeky and ask another one, if I may. And this really is an ignorant one, but well, no, it isn't. That's unfair. It's a long shot one. So at Sulgrave, we're fascinated by the family traits of the early Washingtons and of George Washington. And we know that there are 2 or 3 generations in between. But what you would have heard from Thea early on is the story of an ambitious, aspirational family. The first Lawrence Washington, who married well, did well in the trade, wool trade, internationally as well as locally, and rose up the social scale. And his immediate descendants did well too. And then we have John, 4 generations down in the mid 1650s, who emigrates to Virginia, and maybe someone who's not as comfortable living in England and in English society, but certainly a person with a strong personality and a risk taker and a courageous and a brave person. And then we look 3 generations further on to George, and we find another risk taker, someone who starts off as a surveyor, joins the British Army, gets up to all sorts of scrapes while he's in the army. And then, Grace, I would hand it over to you from that point on. But is it reasonable? Is it reasonable for us at Sulgrave to say, look, if you want to find out the origins or the seeds of the Washington personality and of the courageousness of the beginning of the United States, look no further than here? Grace.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really good question, and it sort of gets us into the big historical question, which is what role do individuals play in causing these kinds of massive, like, sort of world-changing events. And I think, you know, obviously Washington's personality, as you say, being sort of courageous, being ambitious. I mean, obviously he gets up to some sort of quite concerning activities, as we would now see it, in terms of attacks on Native American, going to war with Native American nations, attacking Native American nations, and holding slaves. But he is absolutely ambitious, and I think, and you know, he's clearly such an important leader for the American Revolutionary cause, less in the sort of intellectual sense and of a sort of a Thomas Jefferson or a John Adams, and more as a leader of men. So yeah, I mean, absolutely, that he's certainly these family traits do play a big part. But of course, I think one of the things I'm always interested in is the extent to which, like, underlying social forces also bring about the American Revolution. And so that's something, you know, if you're at the A-level stage or the undergraduate stage, that obviously you want to balance those kinds of assertions of personality against the idea that the underlying social forces are causing and constitutional crisis, and all of these other things are leading to the American Revolution as well.
Could we say he was the right person for the time?
Absolutely. I think yes, absolutely. I mean, he's got that sort of military gift. He's also, in an interesting way, sort of quite a cautious person. He's racked by doubts constantly throughout his about doing the right thing, which is one of the striking sort of counterpoint to that idea that he's very courageous and sort of a risk taker. So yeah, I think absolutely the right person for the time.
Thank you. Sam?
Just to echo Grace there, I think there's clearly something interesting in pondering those family traits and do they persist and do they continue. But I guess my focus will always be more drawn to thinking about the social forces, the cultural context, the world in which people are acting. I think I sort of lean in that direction, as Grace has suggested, rather than emphasizing overly the extent to which George Washington's a risk taker because great-granddad was a risk taker or great-great-granddad was a risk taker. I'd probably think, well, what can we say about the 17th century world, about 17th century Virginia, which helps us to understand how George Washington acts.
Thank you very much for those 2 answers to that wild question. Now, we've got 2 questions here, and I'm going to give them in one go, if I may, and then let the 2 of you respond. So, from Rachel McLean, would you consider the War of 1812 or the American Civil War to be a greater turning point in defining American attitudes towards Britain? And the second question is from Seymour Shaw, and Seymour asks, why did we're going back a bit further now, why did the 7 Years' War fail to cement the relationship between Britain and the American colonies, and instead of creating a lasting settlement, actually caused a split? So, who'd like to go first on those 2? Grace, is that you? Yes, that's Grace. Yeah. Where you go.
I'll have a pitch in. Oh, Grace, sorry, Grace, do you want to go?
No. You go first, and I'll.
I was
Okay.
pitching on first one, if I may, just to say that's a really difficult question. War of 1812 versus American Civil War. I'm going to say War of 1812 because I think it's a key event in the post-revolutionary period where Britain and America are figuring out what their relationship is going to be in the future. I think the Civil War is significant still, but if you're going to force me to choose between the two, as you have, person that asked that question, cracking question, I'm going to say the former. I'm going to say War of 1812. Grace, what do you reckon?
I think I agree with Sam, but I think it's a really fascinating question. The reason I agree with Sam is because if you're British, you are never taught about the War of 1812. At best, you will associate 1812 with Napoleon's invasion of Russia. That's where my mind has always gone with that year. When you go to Washington, D.C., the first thing that a majority of people will say to you, of Americans will say to you is, did you, it's a Brit, did you know the British burned the White House? And you, and your first time in Washington, D.C. will say, nope, I did not know the British burned the White House, which, by the way, was only in retaliation for American actions in Canada. So let's just bear that in mind. So I think from my own experience, I would say that absolutely Americans really identify the British actions in the War of 1812 really, really strongly. But on the other hand, of course, the Civil War and that sort of vying of the Union and the Confederacy for that British alliance is also a really interesting moment that I'm sure Sam knows more about. I'm going to take a punt. I'm going to have a go at Seymour's question about the 7 Years' War, despite the fact that I'm really not an expert in the colonial period. I'm sure Tom will be better placed to talk about this. And I think that the point is that the 7 Years' War has all of these sort of an explosion of effects on the relationship. And I think in some ways it does consolidate. I think in some ways it does consolidate the relationship between Britain and the colonies. And I think, I think it's the beginning of, talking of John Singleton Copley, it's the beginning of Jane Kamensky's wonderful book on John Singleton Copley, A Revolution in Colour, which talks about the celebrations in America at the end of the 7 Years' War, celebrating the king, celebrating, this fantastic, thing that we've achieved together. But at the same time, if you go to someone like Gary Nash talking of sort of underlying social forces, then you'll see obviously things like the quartering of soldiers, things like taxation without representation. The 7 Years' War is causing a lot of rupture, and so I think it just has this explosion of effects, and that's going to be my very hedgy answer.
Thank you, Grace. Sam, do you want to chip in?
I'm going to say I think Grace's, in her words, very hedgy answer sounds spot on good to me as someone who's likewise not a colonial expert. I'd also like to take this opportunity to follow up what Grace said there, and that is heroically pass this question over to our fellow panelist, Tom Cutteram, who I'm sure will be far more expert than I. That's what I'll do.
Oh, very good. Always good to pass it on. Okay, I think we're just about out of time, so I'm going to wrap things up at this point. I've seen no further questions coming. I want to thank our speakers, but before I do, I want to thank our attendees for some excellent questions, and which prompted from our excellent speakers what I thought, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as me, a very lively and informative set of responses and discussion. So thank you to our audience, and thank you to our two speakers for that, which I thought was great. And if I may show you, Grace, that I listened to what you said, both and you, Sam, and I'm going to attempt to merge any attention on individuals with a proper recognition of social forces, and say that I think you both demonstrated why Sulgrave as a house remains an important symbol. It was a symbol before the First World War, and because of the background that you've described, and even with the thought of George Washington as a unifying force, it remains as an important, interesting, and valuable symbol. So, and the trouble is you don't get a chance to come back to me on that. So thank you both very much. I've learned a great deal, and I hope our attendees have enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you very much. Over to you, Nigel.
Nick, thank you very much indeed for sharing that, and warm thanks to Grace and Sam. It was a hugely stimulating hour, and I learned a great deal. And thank you very much indeed. I learned a great deal about the substance and also about the fluency and elegance with which those two presentations were delivered. So thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to our second workshop. And we welcome to this second workshop as our speakers, Tom Cutteram from the University of Birmingham and Jay Sexton at the Kinder Institute at Missouri. Both are good and old friends and trusted and admired colleagues. Our connection lies, and it might be helpful to explain to everyone on the call just how it arose. Our connection lies primarily, though not exclusively, in the Rothermere American Institute, having brought us all together at various points over the last 10 and more years. It's a remarkable institute at Oxford, now brilliantly led by Adam Smith, and who, alas, cannot be with us this afternoon. But it was previously led by Jay, who was a galvanic director and at the RAI for all too short a time. And I'm grateful to Jay for many things, but for his leadership of the RAI, not least. And Tom did his DPhil in very large part at the RAI, and I had the privilege of being the internal examiner for his thesis, which was about elite and gentlemanly culture and class interests in the immense ambition and scale and scope. And there's far too much in that thesis for me to make more than one or two points about. But I would say that among its many strengths was that it caused me to rethink the place of gentlemen revolutionaries, a title of the book which his thesis became, in American history. But I was also very struck, and I am struck frequently in Tom's work, by his giving a sense of the contingencies, anxieties and doubts with which these enormous figures, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, Adams and others, struggled in the late 18th century. And that is just a useful reminder to us that people we speak about as exerting such immense influence upon America and upon the world did not know their individual or their class futures, and that very much brings their challenges to life. So Tom's work's been very important, and it's deservedly had very considerable recognition. Jay's work is so important to so many of us who work on America and the world. Jay's work has that remarkable characteristic of not just telling us that America is and always has been part of a global order, global systems. It has always been a part of those global systems and orders, and it's thoroughly immersed in the world. It's a nation, as Jay puts in one of his recent books, forged by crisis. America really is, on Jay's account, and has been global from the first. And Jay shows us, I think, in much of his work, what it is that has made America so connected to the wider world in diplomacy, in flows of people, immigration, and through flows of trade, and through flows of capital. And in all these respects, Jay's work has had immense influence on me and upon so many other scholars of American history. So we're delighted to have them both with us this afternoon. Delighted to reawaken that RAI connection with Jay and Tom, as with Grace earlier. And this does give me an opportunity to place on record my gratitude to the Rothermere American Institute, to its current director, Adam Smith, whom I've already mentioned, and to Alice Kelly, who I think is on this afternoon's call, who's been immensely helpful and encouraging in making this afternoon's occasion possible. Alice, we're most grateful to you and to all of your colleagues at the RAI. So with that, I'm going to invite Jay and Tom to speak on the subject of common ground and difference. Jay, I think you're going first, is that right? You're not going first. Tom's going to go first.
If you don't mind hearing me first, we thought chronological order made this make more sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. So hold on, let me share my screen. Here we go. So thanks very much, Nigel. That's such a gracious introduction. And for the invitation to talk to this. Thanks to the previous panelists, really interesting to listen to your talks. I think some of what I'm going to say is going to hit some counterpoints with what Grace said earlier, so that might make for interesting conversation. And I will spend a few moments talking about the 7 Years' War as well during this talk. I'm going to basically make 4 points. I'm going to show you 4 paintings, and hopefully I won't take too long about it. We'll start with George Washington in a kind of biographical focus, but as we go through, we might expand more towards thinking about the American Revolution and the American Republic. I'm going to go through more or less to the end of the 18th century. I might dip into the early 19th century, but I'll leave most of the 19th century for Jay, and I think that's how it will work best. So yeah, thanks again. Here we go. Let me see if I can. I think one of the things that's difficult about George Washington is that it's so easy to just think about him as an American hero, an American leader, the leader of the Revolutionary War, the first president. All of these things make George Washington exceptionally American. But I think it's useful for us to start off, at least, by thinking about George Washington as a Briton, a member of a kind of international or transoceanic British world that included the American provinces and many other colonial sites around the globe, as well as the British mainland islands. And not only to think of George Washington as a Briton, as a British person, a British subject, and a member of a cultural world that has its centre in the British metropole. Not only that, but also to think of him as in an even more specific context, which is as a member of British provincial gentry. I think we can think of Washington as a gentleman farmer in that kind of sense. And actually, there's many occasions through his life, both before and after the Revolution, where that's how he likes to think of himself as well. So this is a 19th century painting. This is a painting from the 1850s, which depicts Washington as a gentleman farmer. Of course, there's one crucial difference that you can see very clearly in the painting between Washington's life as a farmer and the lives of many of his contemporaries in Northampton, for example, who were 18th century gentleman farmers. And that is that the people working on his farm are not white tenant farmers, but they are enslaved African-American people. But I want to suggest in this sort of the first point that that I want to make here, I want to suggest that that doesn't make Washington as different from the English 18th century gentry as we might think, because so Washington is obviously an investor in the Atlantic slave economy, right? He is someone who contributes to and benefits from the Atlantic exchange of enslaved people and the products that they create. But that is also true of many people in Britain and England at this time, right? People may not own slaves directly in England, but there's an ongoing kind of project of realization in England and the UK today that many of our own ancestors, our own national trust properties, things like this are built on the profits of the 18th century world of slavery and commerce. So Washington is not that different for this. At the same time, it might be tempting to think of a kind of gentleman farmer as a basically fusty old conservative who kind of sticks to his own ways and so on. But that's not really true either. And I think Washington, like many other sort of middling gentry of this period in the 18th century, was also an enlightened person in the sense that he wanted to apply science and knowledge and learning to ideas about progress and improvement. So he was an agricultural improver, a person who wanted to find new methods of making profit, new methods of exploiting his slaves and exploiting the land around him, just as many of the English gentry were at this time in the 18th century, in a period of, on the eve of the Industrial Revolution, the takeoff of British capitalism. So that's the kind of world that I think we should situate Washington in the mid-18th century before the American Revolution. Now, coming to the revolution itself, I want to briefly try to explain Washington's revolutionary perspective. And I'm going to do that partly by comparing him to a figure from the North, a guy called Philip Schuyler, who was equally a major landowner and slaveholder and revolutionary. And both of these guys, I think what's important about both of these guys is that they came of age at a period of British imperial apogee, right, during the 7 Years' War. And here's the bit where I'm going to talk about the 7 Years' War. Both Washington and Schuyler, as kind of commanders of colonial militias, as local bigwigs who were involved in the kind of political organization of the war, and also the economic provisioning of warfare. These guys benefited from the expansiveness and the military success of the British Empire in this mid-18th century period. They benefited from the fact that the British Empire in the mid-18th century during the 7 Years' War was willing to invest a large amount of political energy and actual cash and capital, actual coin flowing across the Atlantic into the North American colonies. Both Schuyler in the North in New York and Washington down in Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley and the Ohio Valley region, both benefited massively from the expansion and success of the British Empire in that 7 Years' War period. And you might think, of course, so this harks back to the question that we heard earlier. You might think, well, that's going to make this process is going to make the British North American colonies even more British, even more tightly bonded to the British metropole. And of course, as Grace said earlier, in many ways that is the case. But the problem is that the end of the 7 Years' War and the death of George II, the accession of George III as king, both of those things together happen about the same time. Both those things together lead to a transformation in British imperial policy at the center. And by the time you get to the things like the Stamp Act crisis in the mid-1760s, you have people in the provinces like Washington and Schuyler who look at British policy in the center, a policy of retrenchment, a policy of, for example, trying to prevent further settlement to the west, trying to protect the interests of Native American tribes that lived on the western edges of white American settlement, trying to extract rather than deliver coin from the North American colonies, a new set of British policies, which appears from their perspective to be changing the direction of the British Empire, changing the nature of the British Empire. So this is the point I want to make. For both Washington and Schuyler, the American Revolution, departing the divergence from loyalty to the kind of metropolitan British strategy and its leaders, Parliament and ultimately the King, that divergence from their perspective is not a change that they make, it's a change that Britain is making. So they are reactionary, conservative, responsive revolutionaries, rather than people who say, well, okay, we're in this great position, but now we want to change things. The problem is, from their perspective, how do we get back to the way things were during the 7 Years' War when everything was going great? That's what the revolution is for from their perspective. Of course, that's not what the revolution is for many other revolutionaries across the North American colonies. There are many reasons that people become revolutionaries, people become patriots. But for people, for well-landed slave-owning people and various other wealthy people as well who became patriots, trying to respond to and resist this transformation of British policy, I think is a key reason leading us towards revolution. So that fits into the larger argument I want to make, which is that this is not about unbecoming British. In the 18th century, Washington and Schuyler are as British as you could be. Okay, maybe it's not true for Schuyler because he's obviously got various cosmopolitan European roots as well. But for Washington anyway, he's as British as you can be. Can't get more British than George Washington, even through the revolutionary period. the point about many of for patriots, the revolution is a defense of their Britishness and their rights as British, their rights as Englishmen. So in that sense, we can see it as a conservative and a British revolution against a government that is throwing away that British legacy of liberty. By the time, I'm not really going to talk very much about the war, although maybe we'll have that in questions. By the time we get into the 1790s, when Washington is president, and this is a 19th century painting of Martha Washington's so-called Republican court, right? This is her levee. By the time you get into the 1790s, one of the main challenges, one of the most important problems that George Washington as president faces is this ongoing tension about the United States' relationship with Britain on the one hand and France on the other. It's something that the previous panelists kind of mentioned and gestured towards. But I think we should put this in the context of the argument I want to make, which is that the United States and the North American colonies in the United States, its successor, remained extremely British, remained within the circuit of a British North American world throughout the 18th century, even after the Revolution. You can see in this painting, so it's a 19th century, mid-19th century painting. So it's got some sort of anachronistic, sentimental elements, but it's clearly deliberately trying to depict the court of the 1790s under President Washington within the framework of European monarchical courts, right? This is a scene that you might expect to see maybe with a little bit more lavish grandeur in Westminster, Versailles, etc. So the idea is that really, even as a republic, the United States isn't that different from European monarchies, and that people like Washington as president are not attempting to dramatically transform American political culture away from British mores, British political morality and philosophy. The idea, quite the contrary, as Washington's kind of key political advisor, Alexander Hamilton, would say, the idea is to replicate what's good about the British system. The idea is to try to create a fiscal military state with its strong ruling class, capitalist ruling class, through things like banks, but also through things like this court system, this strong central government, to replicate the strength of the British state on American shores. That's the idea. So we might have a chance to kind of come back to thinking about the conflict that this raises, because of course there were many Americans, Thomas Jefferson foremost among them, who really disagreed with and really tried to use as a point of political leverage this ongoing kind of Anglophilia amongst the Federalist leadership class. But the Anglophilia really was there, right? The point was to maintain the strongest possible cultural, political, and economic relationships with Britain. The Jay Treaty of 1794-95 is a key moment for that, when Washington really puts his cards on the table by supporting a treaty negotiated by his own special envoy, John Jay, that was perceived to be very weak on the American side, but a kind of plea to Britain, a kind of surrender to British interests in order to put the United States back into the commercial, the economic orbit of the British Empire, which he successfully gets through the Senate, right, with the help of Philip Schuyler, among other people. So that's where we are in the 1790s. I'm not going to spend very long now in the 19th century, because I'm going to hand that over to Jay. But the point I wanted to make, one point about the War of 1812 and the Treaty of Ghent, since the Treaty of Ghent is obviously a kind of Sulgrave Manor moment, and that is to say that one of the animating causes of the War of 1812 is this issue of impressment, and I think impressment. So it means basically it means British naval ships boarding American ships and taking sailors who they claimed were British deserters from the British Navy. The sailors themselves, of course, claimed American nationality and that they were, just ordinary sailors on American ships. The British would say, well, look at you, you speak English. You must be a British Navy deserter. You can sail a ship. We're probably the ones who trained you. So you've got to come back over here and continue to man our ships in the Napoleonic Wars. because we need all the men we can get. So this issue of impressment, one of the things that led towards war, but it's also something that indicates the continuing ambiguity, the continuing lack of a clear division between British and American identity. That's the whole point. You can't actually tell whether these guys are British or American. They both speak English. They can sail a ship. There's no way, there's no particular, so Nathan Pearl Rosenthal has written how this problem leads towards a development of things like passports, right? But you don't have passports at this time. There's no real way of showing your nationality. The divisions within the Anglo world are not clear, even by the time we get to 1814. And of course, that treaty does not resolve the issue of impressment. The British do not back down on that in any way. They continue to take sailors from American ships even after the treaty. So in some ways, that's the most important outcome of the war. It's a failure from the American perspective. But it's a failure that demonstrates the continuity, I would argue, the continuity of an Anglo world, a British world in which the United States exists, and a world that is about cultural identity and language, but is also about the flows of capital and commerce, because it's a British capital. It's British merchants who are primary in the continuing development and growth of the United States in the 19th century. And that's where I'll hand over to Jay. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. That's absolutely terrific, and just a wonderful start for us in our second workshop. Jay, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And just wanted to start by saying my line on the special relationship, because that's kind of in the air in this event, and obviously today with the G7 meeting and all that. I haven't read the British papers yet, but when I was over there, always on the day that an American president would visit, there's always all these anxious essays in the papers about, you know, is the special relationship any longer? Does it exist? And that sort of thing. And I guess my line on this is that presidents and prime ministers don't own the special relationship. I mean, they're part of it, but it's not about high policymakers. It's not about Boeing executives and retired colonels and all that. That's part of it. But if there is such a thing as a special relationship, it's the people. It's the people. It's the connections between the people with a shared language, a shared culture, shared history. Obviously, in many cases, families span the Atlantic, migration patterns, professional associations, student exchanges, all of that. That's the special relationship, at least from where I sit. And I was thinking about that because Nigel and Tom, always, it's good to see you guys again. And I miss you very much, especially at the end of this long pandemic. As longest I've gone without going back over to the UK since the mid-1990s. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I took my assignment to say a few brief comments about what emerges when we view the long and interconnected histories of the United States and Great Britain. What emerges when we view that transatlantic story through the prism of George Washington, and just as importantly, his legacy, his long legacy. And I'm going to come back to that point in a second. But oftentimes with these so-called great men, it's not just what they do in their lifetimes, it's how they're remembered after the fact that also matters. Like Tom, I'm going to give you 4 points. So that's a good number for today. And I'm going to start with George Washington, and I'm going to end with Meghan Markle. Meghan Markle, who might just be the single most important transatlantic figure of our own era, though it's far too early for us to make that call. Okay, so my first point, this is the basic one, everyone, this is the basic one. The transatlantic connection, yeah? The transatlantic connection in the grand sweep of things, it's run the gamut from the one of the closest, most intimate international alliances of modern history on one end of the spectrum, and on the other end of the spectrum, outright bloody warfare on 2 occasions, and pretty much everything in between, all sorts of competition, all sorts of conflict, all sorts of dispute, but also all kinds of collaboration and association and partnership. And again, not just at the level of high statesmanship and treaties, but also at the level of social interaction and cultural exchange. And I think we've seen from these other presentations how Washington himself embodies this wide spectrum of transatlantic connection. That on the one hand, as Tom's just told us, absolutely, he's an Englishman. He thinks of himself as an Englishman, as do most of these gentlemen farmers in mid-18th century colonial North America. I go further, I'd say he's an Anglophile. My favorite George Washington story, at least my favorite young George Washington story, is his exchange with a tailor. He's got a tailor in London, and you know, he wants the clothing to befit a man of his social rank that the English gentry or the English gentleman would have, and he orders a suit, and the tailor's like, well, what kind of suit do you want? What color? What fabric? He's like, man, I don't know. You're the one over there. I want it to look just like whatever the cool guys in English high social circles are wearing. That's what I want to look like. You know, so that's George Washington. But of course, George Washington is also the leader of the greatest rebellion in the history of the British Empire, with the possible exception of the 1857 India Mutiny. He's also, you know, generates great fear and anxiety among the British central imperial state, not just in his lifetime, but through the 19th and 20th centuries. Okay, so Washington embodies that, but that's what the special relationship, to the extent that there is one, that's what it is. It's dynamic, it's varied. And my point here is that since 1945, but maybe even since before that, I'm thinking about Sam's very good paper about the creation of Sulgrave Manor in the 1920s. So at some point in the mid-20th century, we all began to privilege and prioritize one element of the story, that of collaboration, cooperation. We created a mythic sort of genealogy of 2 countries destined for a close partnership. And in the process of creating this sanitized image, we downplayed, if not airbrushed altogether, the history of conflict and competition. I think Churchill would be a key figure in this process, something like his Histories of the English-speaking peoples, creating this mythic unified history. And that's a mid-20th century idea that's projected back in time. In truth, not only was the post-revolutionary period marked by competition and conflict, but so too was that transfer of power, that so-called transfer of power in the mid-20th century. That was not a seamless process. That was a wrenching, dislocating process, both among British elites, policymakers, and those in the United States. It was just as wrenching as was the struggle for independence in George Washington's time. In fact, I call it not a transfer of power, but a phased revolution within a broader imperial order. And this is worth bearing in mind today, you know, of all days with this summit meeting. You know, I'm not sure. The new administration in the United States promises more harmonious transatlantic relations. We all hope that's the case. But I'm not sure that it's something that we should expect. It's not the natural order of things. Indeed, as we look back, as we get a little distance from the days of the Cold War and the Second World War, it might well be that what stands out as the aberration was that moment of the special relationship in its apogee. Indeed, it might be a sign of the weakness of the current transatlantic connection, that Prime Minister Johnson is going back to the Atlantic Charter, trying to recapture that spirit rather than to create something new. I don't know. But that's point number one. Point number two, also picking up on what Tom was talking about. The heart of the transatlantic connection over time has been economic and material exchange. But this too, also this, has been prone to volatility and disruption. And once again, we see this in George Washington's life itself. George Washington, of course, I would say that though many have tried to make him into a kind of important political theorist or thinker, I don't think that's what's significant about George Washington. He's not a particularly unique political theorist. He's not some theorist of a special relationship that doesn't exist yet, certainly not. If you're to think about, how would he understand himself in these terms, I think like most in his social rank, in the Tidewater of Virginia in the mid-18th century, he would probably think of himself first and foremost as a planter of tobacco. And this is what preoccupied him: the cultivation of tobacco, the sale of that product in a very volatile transatlantic market, and then, of course, the complicated questions of labor management in a labor regime that relies upon the enslaved work of African American slaves. That's what Washington's career, that's a central feature of Washington's career. And he owes his social status to the profits that he's able to realize from the tobacco trade. But as I say, it's not all smooth. The tobacco markets are very volatile in this period. You can make a lot of money, you can also lose a lot of money. And you might know that the planters of Virginia at this time faced real hardship because of a downturn in the tobacco markets, because of increased competition, because of the fickle nature of commercial exchange in this period. And Washington, like others, racked up debts to English merchants, even when he was generating important profits. And this created a sense of dependence on British capital, a lack of autonomy. I think that economic story is running parallel to the story about the disillusionment with the British Empire after 1763. So economics in this sense also has a political implication. And you might have seen in the picture, in the painting that Tom showed, the very first one, I think, the enslaved laborers in that one were baling hay. George Washington pivots, as do many of the planters, from tobacco cultivation to wheat, and also indeed to an early form of agrarian industrialization into milling. Washington becomes tied to milling because of the volatility of transatlantic markets. So I guess my point here is just that the transatlantic exchanges make George Washington, they give him his social status, they help to account for his shifting views on the British Empire in the run-up to the Revolution. They also dominate, of course, his first administration, as Tom said, and here his central preoccupation is with really trying to reintegrate the two economies on either side of the Atlantic after the political break. That's, I think, his central achievement of his presidency, the assumption of state debts, the Funding Act of 1790, those things, trying to get the British capital coming back in to the United States, and of course the Jay Treaty later on, 1795, to create a new commercial framework for transatlantic trade. So what we see, again, is that economic connections also run the gamut of close integration of a single Atlantic system, but also dislocating volatility. And I think that's been true not only in George Washington's time, but it's been true ever since. And perhaps it's because competition and creative destruction are endemic to Anglo-American capitalism, entangling the two nations' economies, even as it's unleashed devastating financial panics and downturns. Okay, point number three. I've only got two left. I'll hustle up here, Nigel. Point number three, looking at the history of the transatlantic connection through the prism of George Washington, what else jumps out? Oh, obviously, this should have been first. The importance of wars, geopolitical reconfigurations, military matters. I mean, perhaps even more than as a planter and a cultivator of tobacco and as an enslaver, perhaps just as central to Washington's identity, self-identity, and to his reputation at the time was his military leadership. You know, of course, even after the Revolutionary days, he's referred to as General Washington. General Washington, that's what he's called. That is the source of his celebrity. Here too, we see that range in the transatlantic connection. Here too, we see Washington fighting or leading colonial troops on behalf of the British Empire in the 7 Years' War that's come up a couple of times. Here too, also apparently Washington, one of the things he's bummed out about in the 7 Years' War is the color of his coat. You know, he wants, back to that tailor, he wants to have a red coat, Fred Anderson tells us. He wants to be looking like those British military commanders, not like some colonial wannabe. So he's bummed out about the color of his coat. And again, he looks rather different than some of the Yankee New Englanders, actually, who take pride in the fact that they're having the blue coats in the 7 Years' War rather than the red ones. Nonetheless, Washington, part of the British imperial military complex, but yet, of course, we know what happens afterwards as he's fighting against those very red coats. The special relationship, to move away from Washington, was forged in warfare. It was wars that fused the two nations together, that prompted them to develop complex supply chains, intelligence operations, and lasting alliances. But warfare did more than just that. Warfare also reconfigured the distribution of power between the two nations. And here, the United States has been the great beneficiary of the joint military endeavors in Anglo-American history, particularly those in the 20th century. It was the Great War, which prompted that titanic reversal of capital across the Atlantic, always before then going from Britain to the United States. After 1917, the other way around. It was the Second World War, of course, which led to the collapse of the British Empire, making it vulnerable, making it possible for the United States to not only defeat Japan and Germany, but also to hijack the imperial infrastructure of the British Empire. The so-called American century was built upon the foundations of the British Empire. In more recent times, one suspects that wars are important, but in a perhaps different way. Since the end of the Cold War, since 1991, perhaps the rudderlessness of the special relationship can be attributed to the relative absence of geopolitical rivals. And the wars that have occurred in this period have actually done much to harm the alliance system. I've just finished listening to David Dimbleby's multi-series podcast on Bush and Blair. I don't know if anyone else has heard that, but well worth listening to take yourself back to that tumultuous period in 2003 and to learn about how the Iraq War led to a fissure in the Anglo-American connection. Now, perhaps that's all changing with a Russian aggression and a formidable China. We will see. But I think warfare and geopolitical competition is key. Last point number 4, a little bit kooky. This point's going to be a little bit kooky. I'm going to go back to some of the stuff Sam Edwards was talking about. But if we think about the transatlantic connection in the longue durée, one thing that jumps out to me is the importance of celebrity figures. Most often, white men, great white men, but the importance of celebrity figures in playing a role of forging a special relationship over time. And here, my point is, it's not just what they did during their lifetimes, it's also how they were remembered, lionized, and celebrated by transatlantic culture. I want to be clear, I'm not endorsing great man theory of history, far from it. I'm just saying that the way that other people have endorsed great man theory has played a significant role in creating this construct of a special relationship. And I think the creation of Sulgrave Manor in the 1920s would be part of this story. I would add that the 1920s is a moment in which many Americans are celebrated in British culture. Abraham Lincoln's statue in Parliament Square is constructed, if I'm not mistaken, or erected in 1921. Lloyd George gives a very good, interesting speech on the occasion. And it's not just what's happening in your country, also what's happening here. If I roll down my window here, throw a baseball a couple of times just down the road, well, more than a couple of times, but if I was a big pitcher, maybe a couple of times, down the road is a shrine to Winston Churchill. You might know Winston Churchill came to mid-Missouri to give his Iron Curtain speech in 1946 in Fulton, Missouri. And it wasn't just the speech that's significant, what happened afterwards. Afterwards, the people of mid-Missouri brought over a bombed out Christopher Wren church from East London, stone by stone, reconstructed it right here in the middle of the heartland. Beautiful Christopher Wren church, a statue to Winston Churchill, a museum down below the church. Now there's a longest portion of the Berlin Wall outside of Europe is also there. And it's a shrine to Winston Churchill. And Churchill's celebrity in this country cannot be underestimated. I mean, he might be one of the most popular figures in the United States today. Now, the trend line of celebrating these figures has been to reinforce social hierarchies. It's not a coincidence that Churchill is most popular among older white men in the United States. If you go to a country club or a golf course, I bet you that's where you're probably going to find a portrait of Churchill. Okay, so it reinforces social hierarchies, but celebrity culture can also run the other way. It can also challenge as well as reinforce social hierarchies. If you're to think about a list of transatlantic celebrities over time, it would also include people like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, who went on a series of speaking tours, the African-American who escaped slavery in the mid-19th century. It would include someone like Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry, another Missourian. If you want to know how the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin got to be such awesome musicians, I think it's the best music in the world, it's because they listened to Chuck Berry on his UK tours in the late 1950s. Chuck Berry, African-American musician. It would include people like the Pankhursts, the radical feminists who had a celebrity kind of cult following in the United States in the 19-teens. And in more recent times, it would include Meghan Markle. And here's where I'm going to end. Meghan Markle, she might well be the most significant transatlantic celebrity figure of our time when it is all said and done. And my question to end it is, which is more significant? Is it more significant that her entry into the royal family has revealed endemic racism on both sides of the Atlantic? Yeah, is that more significant? Or is it more significant that her entry into the royal family has generated a robust response to that racism, a very powerful rejoinder that has stigmatized those views which have been endemic for so long? I don't know. Open question, but time will tell. Thank you very much.
Jay, thank you. Completely brilliant. And you've given us an enormous amount to think about, not just this afternoon, but for some considerable time to come. I hope that you might write about this. No one's better qualified. You've got the structure of the book. You've set it up for us in the last 20 minutes. Do you have any thoughts on those lines?
I've often thought about that. That'll be the thing I hope to do. History of special relationships.
Wouldn't that be good? Wouldn't that be good? So thank you, Jay, and thank you, Tom, very much indeed. I wonder, Tom, if Let me just see if there are any questions that have come through. No, we don't have any that have come through yet. So I would encourage colleagues to ask questions. I mean, our speakers have given us so much to think about. I wonder, Tom, if you could say something about a point with which Grace and Sam have spoken, namely George Washington's self-image. Now, I realize this is really difficult to get to as a matter of method. It's very hard to know what is very much about his self-image. We have hints, and Jay has given us more. I've always found those stories, that the communications with his tailors in London, just extraordinarily insightful. But I wonder if you, Tom, can say something about the respects in which Washington's self-image as a Briton, which was clearly pronounced when he was during the 7 Years' War and during the operations against Native Americans and fighting on the western borders of the colonies. To what extent did that change during his presidency? What do we know about that? Did he begin to regard himself differently at the end of that, at the end of his presidency? Was his self-image much altered? Is there any documentary evidence shedding light on that question?
I don't have a magic bullet document to give you, but my kind of initial thought would be the key thing about Washington. One of the things that makes him so successful as a political figure is that he is brilliant at taking on the role that is required of him at the given moment. So when he's an up-and-coming young, gentleman farmer, he takes on the role of Western colonialist who's willing to be the vanguard of the British Empire. Once he becomes embroiled in the revolution, once he becomes nominated general, once he becomes president, he very successfully takes on and embodies the role of national figurehead. And it is very clear that he perceives himself during the late 1780s and early 1790s. And he has people writing to tell him this all the time, so he doesn't need to be very perceptive to see it. But he perceives himself as a crucial unifying figure for the very fragile new republic, especially given all of the geographical divisions and distinctions that exist within amongst the different states. So it's actually really important, for example, that Washington, as a Virginian, is the figurehead and leader of this pro-British faction within American politics, the Federalist Party, that he can unify the northern colonies, which are kind of instinctively and economically more devoted to the British relationship, with the South, whom he represents as a planter, as Jay was talking about. So I think it's hard to get through. In some ways, I'm not answering the question with the psychological depth that you might be asking for, because I think it's very hard to pierce through the presentation that Washington understood was absolutely crucial, that he should present himself as an American first and foremost at this point. And that's what makes him a successful president and leader.
And that theme does it not, Tom, come through so clearly in study of Washington, that he is very concerned, whatever he thought of himself, however he regarded himself, however he classified himself, he was acutely, supremely conscious of the politics of presentation.
Absolutely. I think that's one of his best skills. And in the end, in some ways, it becomes his downfall, because he's so frustrated and depressed about the fact that people don't love him. In the mid 1790s, once it kind of breaks down politically, it's very, very disappointing for him, having dedicated himself to being what people want. He can no longer achieve that because American politics has divided itself in the mid 1790s. He ends his political career with that disappointment, really.
Yeah, very striking. Thank you both very much indeed. We have a question from Ollie Ackroyd, which, if I may, I'm going to put to Jay first and then to Tom. And Ollie asks the following: can one argue that the British historical past, perhaps on a subconscious level, represented a kind of classical mythological past for a certain segment of the American landed gentry. Jay, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm understanding that correctly, I mean, what that question is getting at is how these colonial elites who are trying to understand and make sense of the imperial reforms from the center that Tom talked about, that London is kind of creating an imperial central brain in a way that it hadn't beforehand, or at least not to the extent that was being envisioned after 1763. To take control, to run the empire as a kind of central command structure. And the colonial elites are looking around thinking, you can't do this, you can't do this. And they're trying to look around for inspiration and justification for those, for that perspective. And they look back to English history, particularly the 17th century. They look back at the writings of those who opposed the centralization of power. They look further back. They look back to the classical world. This is, I think, why they look back to the classical world. They also look out. I mean, they look outwards to other countries and so forth. And maybe transitioning from this question to what you all were just talking about. But one point that strikes me about Washington and his perception and the creation of the American nation in this period is that nationalism doesn't kind of really exist yet in the late 18th century. That it kind of does, and I suppose that it kind of does in Britain and France in particular, because of all these like titanic wars that they're fighting and the need to like justify the sacrifices and the funds and everything. So nationalism is kind of coming into being, but it's not a thing yet. It's not a thing yet. And to the extent to which it is a thing, it's being tethered to these military elite leaders, these generals, these great men, these revolutionaries. And you think that the arc that Tom just described about Washington become a hero, an early quasi-national hero, but then really disillusioned by the post-revolutionary strife and conflict within American politics. That's the story of like revolutionary leaders all across the world in this period. You think about Bolivar. Bolivar, that's the arc that he follows. I mean, I think that you could make a case that Toussaint Louverture in Haiti. The leader of what we now imagine is a national revolution, but yet isn't really a national revolution, and afterwards has all kinds of fragmentation and conflict. So that's just how it happens. So back to the question, yes, they look back to the English past, they mythologize it, create a useful past to justify their political position. And in doing so, I think they're part of a much broader Atlantic story in the age of revolutions.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Tom?
I don't think there's not loads that I want to add to what Jay said, because I think he picked up on exactly what I would say. But there's an example of the way that in looking back to the British kind of opposition, English opposition figures of the late 17th, early 18th century, which obviously American revolutionaries do a lot. A great example of that is George Washington's famous play, Cato, right? From the early 18th century, kind of represents this idea of principled opposition to tyrannical, to kind of corruption, centralizing power. And it does it, it's both a play about the Whig moment in early 18th century Britain and about the classical Roman Empire, classical Roman Republic, the transformation from republic to empire, this moment of defense against corruption and centralization and the excessive desire for personal power and these kind of things. Those are the themes that Washington is obsessed with throughout his life, really, and he gets them, and the culture that he lives in mid 18th century British colonial North America that culture sees them through a double prism of the classical world and then 17th century England, and it gets to him kind of third hand in that way. I think that's very, that's a crucial part of the development of those political thinkers of the American Revolution. And as we said earlier, Washington is not the most complex political thinker, but he perceives these things in the same context that more complex figures like Madison also do.
Thank you, Tom. May I just draw together the beautiful historical point that you made about impressment with the point that Jay has just made about nationalism. Jay will correct me if I'm presenting his claim incorrectly or in a cruder way than it should be presented. But I think his point is that at least in America in the late 18th century, nationalism is a weak, rather evanescent force to the extent that it's recognized at all. So if we bring Jay's thought on that question, which seems to me really rich and interesting and full of significance, together with your point, your observation about the arguments that are made by Royal Naval personnel to American sailors that you speak English, you must be British, you were probably trained by Royal Navy personnel in the first place, all of which sounds utterly specious and ludicrous sort of argument to put. But I wonder what that putting of that kind of argument tells us about their conceptions of what national identity was and what it meant in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
Shall I try and go first on that? I think the basic point is that these kinds of conflicts are the moments that help to create national identities. They're not conflicts that emerge because of existing national identities butting up against each other. It is precisely in the moment of, okay, someone's boarded our ship, they're asking for all the Englishmen who want to go back to the Royal Navy. That's when you decide, well, that's when the problem of the existence of multiple possible identities becomes important. And of course, it's completely wrong to say that's when you decide whether you're American. That's a practical decision. Do you want to go and serve in the Royal Navy in the French wars or not? Of course you don't. Of course you're going to be American. But these kind of moments lead to the kind of bureaucratic and the official forms that separate out nationalities. So they lead to the necessity of creating American nationality. I think that's the point that Nathan Pearl Rosenthal tries to make in his book Citizen Sailors, where I basically draw this point from. And of course, at the same time, that's the argument that Linda Colley would make, right, about the Franco-British rivalry. By the end of the 18th century, British nationality is completely created, or is in the process of creation because of rivalry with France. We have to have something that distinguishes us. Our sense of selfhood as Britons, that's the title of Colley's book, our sense of being Britons comes from our sense of being against France and needing to defeat them. So
that's really interesting. Thank you very much, Tom. And it sets that question in a wider and richer context. We have only 2 or 3 minutes to run, and we've just had a question which has come in literally just now, and it's a rather lengthy question from Kalyan Yokota for Jay. Thanks to you for your insightful and always engaging talk. And says, as we saw in the first panel, in the late colonial post-revolutionary period, connections to Great Britain, especially upper-class elite connections, provided cultural capital to those who could lay claim to them. Would you say this dynamic was inverted in the post-World War II period, when, as you rightly point out, the US gained global prominence? She goes on to say, Americans were and often still are ridiculed by European commentators for their idealization of British culture as upper-class stroke posh, certainly in the early Republic, but also continuing today, and with their obsession with all things royal. Would you say that even though Americans and Britons purport to know one another so well, we continue to hold stereotypes and misconceptions about one another to suit particular historical contexts? It's a lot to chew on there, Jay.
Yeah, that's a great
question. Can you answer in 90 seconds?
It's a great question. Thanks, Carrie Ann, for that. I think that's right. I think that one of the key things there is the way in which views of one country or the other are entangled in social politics and class. I think that's always been an important feature and dynamic here on both sides. And one thinks about like the working men of the Victorian days looking to American democracy as a good thing, and how that's kind of shifted over time as the kind of political economic regimes have shifted. So I think that's a key point. And I would just also then say ethnicity. You know, my Oma, who's still alive, my grandmother, bless her, German American and married into an Irish American family. She hates the Queen, man. She hates the Queen. The fact that I took an allegiance to the Queen over there, I don't think she's forgiven me. So ethnic politics can also play into that. And can I just say, I still don't get it. I don't get why all these Americans love the royal family. Don't get it. I'll never get it. But it is part of this complicated story we're trying to tell today.
Well, for your part and for Tom's part in telling that complicated story, and for Sam and Grace, their parts in telling that complicated story, and for everybody who's participated, listened, watched, asked questions, made this occasion possible, to all of our partners at the RAI, Manchester Metropolitan, and Birmingham and Oxford and the Kinder Institute at Missouri. We prize these relationships. They are, as Jay said, the texture of, if there is a special relationship, that's their texture, that's their nature, that's their essence. It's the links between our civil societies that matter so much. These are the links that endure. And one of the reasons they endure is because institutions such as Kinder and the RAI, in its own way, Sulgrave, attempt to foster the conversations around them, which leads, I hope, to greater understanding of them, especially in historical context. And I think today we've had simply scintillating contributions to that end. And I'm more grateful than I can say to everybody here today for having made this first Sulgrave seminar a success. I hope that it will be the first of many and that they will become regular. That's our emerging hope and plan. Sulgrave, and my sense and the tone and tenor and content of this afternoon's discussions is that that sentiment's probably quite widely shared. Thank you all very much, everyone.